that. I came to the slap with a background set. You came to with a different background set. And we started to say, what all goes into that background set?
That's where philosophy starts to become
I think that's where philosophy is important. And we as philosophers, I think, articulate, well, we have reason, we have emotions, we have memory, and there is something that physiologically goes on. I have a body and it's all worked out, and that it's going to articulate the main capacities or the main faculties. But I think at a very general level, and I think the philosophers have to work hand in hand with the neuroscientists and with the psychologists, because and this is my complaint about early modern philosophy. It's not a very strong complaint, but that they were trying to do philosophy of mind and epistemology 300 years before we knew anything about neuroscience, and 300 years before we really knew anything about psychology. So it's a lot of failed experiments right along the way, or failed theories along the way. But the other thing, though, I would want to say is, as we go on to develop what I think will be a better understanding of the mind, both epistemologically and metaphysically, is that we stop turning virtues into vices, as I think of it. So to say, for example, that we have, and then you talk about the base level, the slap happens, or there's something moves low to the ground, and there's a direct automated, something that you didn't think about, didn't feel about, connection to the spine, and your body reacts in a certain way. I want to say that's a good thing that has happened to human beings, that we have evolved certain automated physiological responses to certain kinds of sensory stimuli, rather than turning that into a vice, right, or a bad thing. And seeing that as, if the human being has certain automated reflexes in place, that means we have to go down the road of subjectivity, that we're not really responding to reality and so forth. Or if we say we have emotions, right, which we do have emotions, and I think emotions are positive. They certainly an important role in our evaluative structure, figuring into our overall understanding of the meaning of life. And we also know that sometimes we can use our emotions the wrong way, let them use us instead of using them. So emotions come with pitfalls. But rather than, as many early epistemologies have done, is said, well, we have emotions, and emotions are on the subject side of things. So
the enemy of reason.
That's right. And so, so they're irrational, and we turn something that is a very valuable tool in human psychology into the enemy of human psychology.
You see that a little bit with...
Attention men who still believe in the American dream. In a world gone mad, the Precision 5 from Jeremy's Razor stands as a beacon of sanity. 5 blades of superior engineering offer a shave as unshakable as your faith that the nation's best days still lie ahead. Experience an exceptionally smooth, remarkably close shave, and a testament to the fact that merit still matters. Stop giving your money to woke corporations that hate you. Get Jeremy's Razors Precision 5 instead. Available now at jeremy'srazors.com, walmart.com, and Amazon Prime.
You see that a little bit with the evolutionary psychologists who claim that because we evolved for a substantial period of time on the African plains, that our emotional and motivational systems are no longer properly adapted to the modern world. It's like, I find that's a variant of the argument that you just laid out, and that it also has the echoes of that rationalist, some variants of rationalism, that proclamation that emotion is the enemy of reason. It's like, emotions are unbelievably sophisticated. They're low resolution and they're quick. They're not as quick as, say, spinal reflexes, but they're faster than thought. And they're also broader than thought. And they also enable us to evaluate when we don't have enough information to think. And they have their pitfalls like everything human, because nothing human is omniscient. And so we're going to make errors. But the idea that there's a fundamental antipathy between the emotional, the id, let's say, and the ego, that, because that's a variant of that psychoanalytic theory, that is a misunderstanding of the way that the nervous system is integrated. So let me run something else by you. Since we've laid out this, I want to run a proposition by you. And it's sort of a variant of the meme theory, although it takes into account the idea that so-called memes, abstractions, compete across historical and evolutionary time. So imagine this. So
this is memes in the Dawkins sense.
Yeah. So imagine that there is this level of sensory input that is as close to corresponding with objective reality as we can manage. And then imagine that that's interpreted within this hierarchical framework that we described. Levels of abstraction that rise up to ineffability, essentially. That would be something like the meaning of the fact that you hit the table in this particular context, right? Okay, so now imagine you've got this. Imagine that every level of that hierarchy and the totality of the hierarchy competes across evolutionary time. So one way of grounding our thinking in data is to assume that all of what we know emerges from raw sense data. But there's another way of thinking about it, which is that the data is interpreted within a hierarchical framework that's full of feedback loops, right? And there's variant forms of those upper level hierarchies. But those forms compete across time. And the more successfully they compete across time, the more they become instantiated physiologically. That's a Baldwin effect selection mechanism. The higher order interpretive structures that produce the best reproductive outcome across time are more likely to become automated at a instinctual level. Emotions would be like that. Like they're not as automatized as spinal reflexes, but they're quite automatized because the sets of emotions that human beings have are very similar. Anger, fear, surprise, joy, etc. Everyone feels those. When and where is different, but the fact of the emotions is the same. Then imagine that this is something like the domain of iterable and playable games. So imagine that there's a variety of different interpretive frameworks that we lay upon more basic sensory data, but that a relatively small subset of those interpretive frameworks has the capacity for sustainable improvement. So you could think about this in the context, let's say, of a marital relationship, right? There's a very large number of ways that your marriage can go wrong. Like an indefinite number of ways that your marriage can go wrong. But then there's a constrained number of ways that it will go right. And that's because it's a difficult target. Imagine that the specifications are something like, for your marriage to be successful, the micro routines and the macro routines have to be such that you're voluntarily okay with them and your wife is voluntarily okay with them. And they bond you more tightly together across time. And this would be the optimal situation. As you lay them out together, they improve. Okay, and so you could imagine that as the basis for an optimized contractual relationship of any form. But then you could also imagine that the number of variants of the way that you can treat each other for all of those conditions to be met would be low. There's a very small number of voluntary playable games that are iterable across large spans of time that improve as you play them.
Right.
Okay, so then you'd get an evolutionary pressure as well on the domains of possible philosophy, right? That they'd fill up something like a space. And that seems to me to be reflective. It's weird because that's also reflective of an empirical reality, but it's not the reality that's associated with basic sense data. It's more the fact that there is a finite number of complex games that are voluntarily playable and that improve. And that's also a fact, right? I mean, and that would be, I think that's partly why there are patterns of ethics that tend to emerge in many different cultures, even independently, right? And that also makes a mockery in some ways of a really radical relativism. It's like, it's not the value space, the philosophical space isn't relativistic because there's a finite number of interpretive frameworks that actually have anything approximating productive staying power. And that is reflective of something like the structure of reality. It's more sophisticated reflection than the basic sense data. And so, see, I'm saying this because I'm trying to mediate between the postmodern claim that we see the world through a narrative, which I think that's true. I think all the neuroscience data points in that direction. And then you might say, well, any old story goes then. It's like, no, just because we see the world through a story doesn't mean that the stories themselves aren't constrained by empirical reality in its most sophisticated sense. And it also doesn't mean that the stories, even though they're stories, fail to correspond to reality.
Okay. That's extraordinarily rich, everything that you're laying out there. Let me just start with one thread to pull. I do not like the language that says we see reality through a narrative. I understand the attraction of it.
I can make a more technical description.
No. If we just start with that formulation, I think that's a dangerous formulation. I do think the postmoderns are on board with that. But notice what it says. It says there's a we, there's a me, and then there's a narrative, and then there's reality out there. And that I have to go through this narrative to get to reality.
Like a screen.
That's right. And it might be, it might have some chinks in it. It might be opaque, right? But also what this narrative is has got a huge amount of stuff built into it, right? All kinds of background expectations and theories and slippery terms, right? And so forth. What I would say is, to use this language, is that narratives are things that we use to see reality if the narrative is true. So sometimes narratives get reality right. Sometimes narratives are wildly off basis. Right?
Yeah, that's in keeping with this idea of competition across time.
Okay, that's for sure. But rather than seeing the narrative as a screen or as an obstacle or an intermediary, it itself is a tool. It's a state that our psychological conscious apparatus is in when we are relating to reality. Okay, so that's if we get it right.
Okay, so
but if we mess it up, then it does become something that we try to see reality through, and we're in a problematic situation.
Okay, so let me reformulate the description.
Okay.
And then let's see if that rectifies that problem. And then let's see where we can go with that problem, because I'll object to your objection and see where that goes. So I would say a narrative is a description of the structure through which we see the world, right? That's a different claim. So because it's not a narrative until I tell it to
But then you've dropped reality out of the picture.
Well, that's exactly why I want to have this discussion, because I don't want to, I think it's very dangerous. It's kind of obvious to drop reality out of the situation. But you're right that the danger of the postmodern formulation which is that we see the world through a narrative, let's say, is exactly that, is that the reality drops out of the equation. There's nothing but the text, let's say. Like, if there's a competition between narratives for their functionality, let's say, reproductive and otherwise, that would go some way to addressing that problem, because there'd be a Darwinian competition between narrative structures that would prioritize some over others. And so, but the description part, the idea that it's a description is relevant. So imagine that wolves in a pack